Good morning and welcome back to Sunday Storytime here on Gaming with ADHD, where today we're going to be reading Hot Wars by Malik Toms from the pages of Shadowrun 6th World Edition Firing Squad. Hot Wars by Malik Toms. It was the exit interview that did her in. We have to inform you that we keep the equipment. She blinked hard, looked from one man to the next. A panel of 5 uniformed officers sitting across a squat brown folding table covered in a black cloth to project an officious tone. What do you mean, keep the equipment? Regulation 459.83 of the Code of Post-Military Operations states that we have the right to retain any military-grade equipment issued to the enlisted upon the conclusion of their service. She blinked. To be clear, we are talking about cyberware here, right? The men just nodded. After, when she felt hollow and emptied out, she had no choice but to go to Wolverine. Centurion offered much better pay, but Wolverine understood. They'd put back what was taken. The wire mattered more than she wanted to admit. It was a part of her the way violence was a part of the streets she'd grown up on. Vanessa always found a way to stay removed. As a kid, she found her way into sports, so nobody would ask her to sell drugs or be a lookout. In the service, she leaned on her intellect, choosing an MOS that kept her away from the people who shot back. Her unit, 52 Bravo, did cleanup on the cars and drones. She didn't have to go on the front line and put a round in a guy or watch some hopped-up ninja type slice through half a dozen of her buddies before someone on the losing team figured out where his armor wasn't. She'd seen all those things and worse on data replay or live fire repair jobs far removed from the front. Yet here she was, riding in a GMC Banshee, dipping between the narrow spires of office buildings toward her first real frontline action. In the interview, Wolverine tried to explain that what they do isn't new. The recruiter said, "Did you know Pepsi was once the 6th largest military in the world? This was long before extraterritoriality existed, back when the world still had things called Cold Wars. Now it's just an unending series of isolated hot wars. The battlefields spring up between UCAS city blocks more than they do in the desert or the Yucatan." The cabin rocked as the Banshee screamed past a row of skyrakers and pushed toward the low-slung buildings of Hyde Park, St. Louis. There were 6 soldiers and 2 pilots with her, not including the captain. 3 soldiers kitted out in heavy-rated security armor and MEMS tactical vests sat apart from the rest. They were ex-Devil Dogs, old-school Cass Marines. The way they held themselves gave it away. Bearded white human had been the special operator military default for a century. Nowadays, trolls and orcs were the usual ground pounders, and the old-school guys like these were privatized. Meanwhile, she did what dwarves always did. She went support. What she lacked in stature, she more than made up for in situational knowledge. Another soldier, a clean-cut kid who didn't look a day over 18, said, "The scan is that you're a researcher, Bravo." He showed his hands. "So, wow us with your research." That comment was met with chuckles. He'd said it out loud, not over the radio link where everything was recorded later for later CYA-based analysis and finger-wagging. Vanessa nodded. She considered ignoring the jab, but she knew this was a test. Everywhere she went, there were tests. She activated her comlink and spoke clearly. "West Side Rippers are the only organized gang in this drop zone. Intelligence reports suggest they are minimally armed, pistols and less than a dozen submachine guns likely, the Shiawassee Model 70s, maybe 1 or 2 71s. Resistance will be fierce, though. The attack on the client vehicle is in character. Our clients were in a high-priced security vehicle in territory where they really don't belong. The Rippers are looking to solidify their hold on the area and bolster recruitment, so they cannot afford to allow any actions that make them look weak. New membership capabilities are unknown, though statistically speaking, they should have at least 1 active spellslinger." They were getting closer to the drop zone. The buildings were getting shorter, older. From this range, the scattered clumps of cars that looked as small and fat as roaches. The few people on the streets of Hyde Park looked even smaller, huddled in their winter coats and bracing against the storm clouds she could see forming in the distance. "Yeah, Bravo, but none of that explains how some street thugs disabled a fully armed and functional Kamakechi sect transport in the middle of the roughest hood in the city." She met eyes with the soldier who was trash-talking her, and he was still grinning. She'd never been good at reading people. It could be respect, could be mirth. Either way, it didn't matter to the task at hand. The clients demanded security pull over for a photo op, she said. Again with these damn desolation tourists, the captain growled over the integrated comm channel. He pointed at individuals seated around her. Okay, you three drop in standard cover while second team follows for extract. Newbie, you stay on deck. I'm not risking lives to get that POS transport out of the hot zone. That won't do, sir. What? It won't do, she repeated, shaking her head. She's right, sir, one of the devil dogs said. The car is part of the contract. We need to get the vehicle out as well. Oh, what the shit. Okay then, Bravo. You're on the deck. We'll extract the primary, and you and my heavies, Suarez, Fritz, and Grant, will stay to secure and mobilize the secondary. She stared out the porthole. This feels wrong. The one called Suarez grinned. You'll get past it, newbie. Don't think of them as gangbangers or civvies. Think of them as enemy combatants. They bleed just the same. No, I mean all this fog, she replied. It's moving in way too fast. What had been a thin mist hardened now into a billowing cloud. It coalesced around them. The Banshee rocked and then dropped hard. Klaxons sounded, and the pilot called back to them. We got magic on the field. Commander turned to the pilot and said, Well, do something. If overly artificial cybers could glare, his certainly did. Do I look like a damn spell slinger to you? Jesus. Then hail base for spell support. The response roared back over all open channels. Magical support is not in the contract. Needs to be cleared with the primary when we land. So rules of engagement gave way to cost-benefit analysis here. Private work was no different than the service at all. You have to drop now or never, the captain barked. The three devil dogs slammed down their ballistic masks and moved quickly to the two drop lines. Everyone else followed. Even in the shaking cabin, they moved with precision, filing to the edge of the drop line and dropping soundlessly through the thick smog. Vanessa was the last in line. Before she'd left the service, they'd been experimenting with Artemis Eagle harness suits the soldiers could wear and drop out of the sky like sci-fi soldiers. Here they had ropes and all the threat that came with airdropping out of an LAV at 250 meters. Strapped tight to the drop cord, she plummeted through a sheet of gray-white smog thick enough to choke on. Suddenly the fog parted and the ground shot up to greet her. Vanessa was falling into a battle scene. She barely had time to focus. The streets were filled with the fires of burning wrecks. Bullets whizzed by her as she fell. The auto-rig kicked in, slowing her descent as she tried to follow her training, taking quick notes of enemy positions before focusing on her landing. The cord snapped to the right, and she spun off her axis. The quicklime rig caught, and she dangled in the air 3 meters from the ground as bullets continued to surge past her. She reached into her MEMS tactical pouch and freed a chem stick. She touched it to the rope, which dissolved instantly. She tucked herself into a ball and rolled as she struck the pavement, hoping the armor would absorb the hit. It did, mostly. She popped up, limping. 2 soldiers were on her immediately. One put a hand on her back, grabbing her harness and yanking her behind the target vehicle. Vanessa paused to catch her breath, the sounds and smells of the scene sinking in. She closed her eyes for a moment, marking the weapon sounds. She could hear the steady thump of Alpha assault rifles pouring out covering fire. There was a pop and a whoosh, and she knew that someone from her side had let loose an underbarreled grenade. The report came back as a deafening boom somewhere down the block. This wasn't how civilian-side combat was supposed to be. It felt more like the Yucatan than the streets of St. Louis. The trio of devil dogs had already pushed ahead and were engaging enemies from the middle of the street. Their targets were dressed in hoodies and ducked low behind old foreign cars, withering under the firepower of the Wolverine soldiers. She could only see 2 of the other supporting soldiers. Her grinning nemesis was nowhere to be seen. Hostile fire came back to them in waves. She recognized the crackle of newer rifles, Colt M23s to be exact. The intel had been very wrong. This ordnance was not street gang level. She counted out the individual reports as she'd been taught, breathed deep, and called it out over the comm channel. Captain, we've got multiple threats with heavy weapons. They've got assault rifles, at least 17 in all. She didn't get a response, and she didn't really expect one. Urban intel relied on local police files and reported firearm sales. When companies flooded the sprawl with gray market weapons to boost their profits, there was no way to ever really know what the other guy had. The real arms race was on the streets. It had been like this since the UCAS broke up. The Kamakichi transport van was dented and pocked with more bullet impacts than she could count. Still, it looked like it could drive out of there. The curb behind the transport was as bad as any war scene she'd ever seen from her drones. Members of the original security team lay dead, practically on top of the dead gangers, but there were men and women, mostly teenagers. Blood was everywhere. Then she spotted her grinner. He'd survived the initial landing, but he'd taken several rounds in the legs and belly, and they'd punched through his medium armor, even at range. She moved to him, checked his pulse. Nothing. A man in a torn business suit with a Wolverine pin attached to his lapel was in the passenger cabin of the van. He saw Vanessa, leaned out of the transport, and asked, Are you the rigger? She nodded, still looking at the bodies practically at her feet. He grabbed her vest and shouted, Get clear on one thing, rigger. These are not bystanders out here. Anyone not under our contract is to be treated as an enemy combatant. Understood? She nodded, but she didn't understand. The clients were a couple in their 40s with 2 kids, a boy and a girl. The kids were wild-eyed, laughing and pointing, their glee mixing with the gunfire. They'd already been told what she knew. Nothing the gangers had could get through the passenger cabin's reactive shielding. So this was a live video game to them. The husband was doing what he could to keep them calm. The wife was losing it on the suited officer. Vanessa only caught snippets, enough to sense the anger coming off the woman and the frustration from the sergeant. That was enough to get the meaning of what they were saying. They'd paid a premium for security, and her family shouldn't have to go through this. Vanessa heard the officer mention the magic using corporate terms like liability and additional fees, but the client was too angry to listen, too angry to agree to terms. She mentally keyed her mic and said, Captain, we are negative on astral support down here. He replied, Then you need to get the primary out by ground. We are not going to risk the LAV against magic. Repeat, we cannot extract. Suddenly, the sound of the big bore rifle punched through the air, and one of the 2 men who dragged her to safety crumpled. She recognized the sound immediately as a Springfield M1400. Screams of "Sniper!" poured across the comms as she counted down the seconds for the reload. The Devil Dogs were still pushing the attack south. They'd gunned down 3 more people before falling back to cover in a narrow alley between a stuffer shack and an apartment building. The rifle cracked again in their retreat, and one of them flew backward. His buddies grabbed him and pulled him, what was left, to safety. Suarez yelled, "We can't stay here!" She kicked into gear and decided she needed to get the vehicle working, which meant jacking into the rigger control interface. Vanessa pulled open the driver's side door. A security officer in his BDUs was still jacked in and slumped over in the seat. She checked for a pulse, found none, and pulled him out of the seat. She needed to get a better read on the situation. She fed the cord into her jack and started running diagnostics on the repair. Self-inflating tires were already at work, bracing against the damage of heavy caliber rounds. The engine was functional, but front and rear cameras had shut down. This transport model was top of the line and came stocked with a trio of micro-skimmer drones. She considered radioing in for permission to apply the resources, but thought better of it. They needed eyes in the sky. They needed to find the sniper and whatever else was waiting for them in these streets. Better to ask for forgiveness later under these conditions. She ejected one from the launcher to get a better look at the field. The combat zone could have been her own block. Growing up, Brennan Street was a long row of brown and gray tenement apartments interspersed by storefronts. Above the strange cloud cover still blotted out the sky. People sporting bright purple hoodies ducked behind the cars that lined the street, some of which were now burning. Others stood in doorways, firing off shots before ducking inside and away from the return fire. There was a laundromat 200 meters south. Through the drone's eyes, she could see people clustered inside. They looked terrified. She supposed they ought to be. There was a full-scale war taking place right outside their door. She wondered how many of them had friends in the conflict, or children. They made the choice to be on the ground and in the fight, and now they were paying for it. Vanessa shook this thought away and repositioned the drone to continue scanning for threats. She found the sniper crouched on a roof a half block north of the laundromat. Caught the muzzle flash as he pumped out another murderous round. The orc was dressed in a black long coat and looked too old to be a ganger. She remembered what the officer had said, though, and quickly called in his position. In response, an underbarrel grenade arced toward the target, detonating on the rooftop. Directed fire followed, and when the smoke cleared, the shooter was down. Hot wars indeed, she thought, and continued scanning and feeding target locations to her team. Her diagnostic check flashed a report, and she keyed a line to the team. "We need 3 more minutes for repairs. Fall back to my position." The map showed that this stretch of Bremen Avenue fed into Interstate 70. they could get underway. It was a clear path to safety. There was a school between there and here, and she hoped they wouldn't pursue that far. They might, though. It struck her that the people here were trying to protect their way of life. What was she protecting? Who was she fighting for? A too rich family who wanted to treat their kids to a glimpse of how the other half lives? For that glimpse, dozens of people had already died. When she was in the service, she weighed deaths against the freedom it provided to her fractured nation, her collection of states and cities. Here the scales balanced differently. The security team moved back toward the vehicle, one soldier laying down cover fire as the rest moved to a shielded position and laid down fire so he could retreat. They moved like this until every person who could walk was in the transport. She noted that they hadn't stopped to retrieve the dead. A second team would be deployed for that task, complete with auditors and insurance adjusters to determine cause of death and resultant compensation. Her transport's rear-mounted cameras only needed a final tweak to come back online. In milliseconds, her senses were flooded with a panoramic display of the warscape behind her. Targeting reticules locked on to at least a dozen more hostiles, outlining them in red. Some were just children and old people leaning out of windows in the buildings above. Others, barely fighting age, rushed into the street to scavenge the bodies of the fresh dead. She saw a man dressed in a Hungry Harry's uniform pull a gun off a body to fire ineffective shots at the fleeing transport. That was when Vanessa decided who she was fighting for. She certainly wasn't fighting for the client. She was doing it for a paycheck and a hot bowl of ramen at the end of the night. She was doing it for the promise of something better, for the wire and what that meant to her. That is, what she still was, after all, a soldier, a rigger. This battlefield had now proved itself more dangerous than the dozen others she'd spilled blood on over her career. There weren't good guys and bad guys here, just the ones with the biggest guns. They had been her people. As she drove back toward the nearest Wolverine FOB, she wondered how she could make sure she'd have the biggest guns next time.